Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail part 23. I really felt rather proud of myself. The flight had been long and over areas which were completely out of my previous experience, but I'd managed. It had been a real coming together of all of my training and experience. I really felt as though there wouldn't be anywhere in the world I couldn't reach now. I was resolute that as soon as we had won this war, I'd be off in an aircraft just like my little blue Typhoon and bring the sights like those I had seen that day right into people's homes, captured through the lenses of my cameras and on movie film. Once the heavy trunk had been unloaded from the Typhoon and I had arranged for the security of the aircraft, I left to make purchases before the shops closed. At Böblingen, most of the personnel had changed around and I couldn't get any transport. I'd have to rely on the buses and trains. After picking up the equipment from Foto Binder in Stuttgart's Königstraße, I made my way out to Heutigsheim to stay at my parents' home overnight. I couldn't see Gretel on this trip because she was still away on her labor service, but I did call her father just before takeoff. The various packages were loaded into the small luggage compartment of the Typhoon and I left for Mannheim, about half an hour's flying. Now I had to change my plans due to a slight misunderstanding. Mannheim had two aerodromes, one at Käfertal and the other at Sandhofen, where our wing HQ had been. The baggage that I was due to collect was at Sandhofen while I was on the other side of Mannheim. There wasn't enough time to arrange a transfer and so I opted to stay another night and finish the trip in the morning. I wasn't going to lose by this either. I was offered a room in one of the best hotels in Mannheim, the Palast, with our Kommandantur picking up the bill. I really enjoyed my dinner that night and what for me was a taste of real luxury. Afterwards, I went down to the Holzkistel, which means woodbox bar in the hotel, for a nightcap. There was good music and dancing, but this was brought to an unceremonious halt when the air raid siren started up at around 10 o'clock. If it was a real air raid, I wasn't too surprised. Quite close at Ludwigshafen was the BASF works, which would be a prime target if bombing started. Far from striking terror into the hearts of everyone, it actually turned into a rather happy social event. Because the Holzkistel bar was built well below ground level, it had been designated as a kind of air raid shelter and soon filled up as the guests came down. It was a really great atmosphere, nobody seemed to be scared, even though upstairs the heavy guns were hammering away loudly without us knowing if it was all AA fire or if some of the explosions were in fact bombs. The barman did very well that evening, and even when we heard the all clear just before midnight, many people stayed on even though they were only dressed in their dressing gowns and pajamas. This kind of thing demonstrated one of the advantages, few as they are, of wartime. A combination of common purpose of all being in it together. The necessity to take unusual measures brings people together and offers them a platform on which they can communicate without the hindrance of the usual social strictures. It's a shame that we've never been able to foster the same egalitarian society without a lot of people being killed as a byproduct. My nocturnal socializing caused me to sleep late on Sunday morning, and it was only after a nice lunch at the hotel that I felt up to the last leg of my journey. I caught the bus to Käfertal and to my surprise I found that the outstanding bags had arrived and were already loaded into the Typhoon. However, being a Sunday, there were few staff on duty and I couldn't get any fuel. But in my estimation I still had enough for the leg back to Zerbst and set off, landing there at 1700 hours. After such an adventure, I suppose I thought there might be someone there to welcome me back, but they were all in town, enjoying the Sunday off. During our time at Zerbst, we did get some special missions to fly as a squadron. Hitler himself was making speeches in the Reichstag in Berlin, and we were based just over 100 kilometers away, close enough to be ordered in for fighter cover. Thus, we spent quite a lot of time on patrol over and around Berlin, waiting for the RAF to try to bomb Hitler and the Reichstag, not much hope of action there. On July the 18th, we were transferred to Neuruppin, north of Berlin, where some of us stayed until the 23rd. Then we all assembled again in Bayreuth, down in the southwest, flying fighter cover for the Führer as he attended the Wagner Festival. Bayreuth was pleasant enough, with its small airport up on the hill, and it was good to be flying, although for most of the time at readiness from dawn to dusk. But most days we would have time to go into town and take part in the festival which was being celebrated. This had brought a great collection of interesting guests from all over Germany, many of whom were pleased to invite the victorious Luftwaffe pilots for a meal or just for a drink. We felt important, if a little fraudulent. I was still the Gruppe's communications officer and responsible for having the appropriate systems set up. At Zerbst there wasn't too much of a problem, the facilities being fairly modern anyway. All that the Nachrichtenzug had been tasked to do was to run out field telephone links to the squadron dispersals. There was no radio telephone, and so we had to get our 1.5 kilowatt station set up. One in use and one for backup. The well-trained crew saw to this with little or no supervision. By now, this had become routine, and I felt little ambition to improve things or come up with innovative ideas. I still believed that our communications could be greatly improved and that they would be the key to a sustained success in the future, but I had no fire in the belly anymore. It had been quenched by repeated frustrations and humiliations in the past. I felt that one can only beat one's head against a brick wall for so long. Sooner or later, one has to realize that it hurts and stop. Maybe if I'd realized how right my predictions about communications would be and how many air crews would suffer, I might have tried again. Experience in the French campaign had shown that we hardly ever needed to use our 1.5 kilowatt transmitters for tactical exchanges in Morse. The telephones were always available quickly, and it had been an easy matter to connect our switchboards to the French public circuit. Most orders and instructions had been transmitted by use of the telephones. It was really very simple. Staff HQ would call the Gruppe or squadron leader or his deputy, or he would call HQ, and the orders were almost always the same. Get up there and have a look around. If you see anything that is enemy, shoot at it or shoot it down. The campaign had gone so well in our favor that there had been no need for complex tactical analyses or instructions. Rarely there would be a time when, after we had left, some further information would come in and Förster would try to transmit it to us, but we were most times out of range. For the most part, it was a case of going to have a look and acting on our initiative. So it looked as though my adversary, Adolf Galland himself, was right after all. "Take those damned radios out so that we can fly higher and faster," he said. In the short term, and looking at this one campaign, it could have been a strong argument, but the battles which followed were not going to be like this one. The enemy was learning by his mistakes and inadequacies, and there would be no room from us to be complacent. Today, as I researched the material for this book, it is thoroughly sickening to read how the British developed their direction-finding equipment and communications whilst we bathed in the glory of our success. They saw the potential in developing one of the most significant factors in the battle that was to come. It seemed that some people there listened and saw the potential of what could be, whilst we, due to the lack of foresight of people like our fighter leaders, would have to be reliant on wing signals, sign language, and vague telephone calls. There was still some fight left in me, so I cast around to see what could be done. Being close to Halle and Köthen, an experimental and research communication station for the Luftwaffe, we were at least able to pull a few strings and get the best quality quartz crystals fitted to the radios in our aircraft. I heard rumors about new detection equipment that was being developed called Würzburg and Freya, but we couldn't find out much more than this. The new crystals greatly improved the range of our sets, but there was nothing much else that could be done. The French campaign had at least started a debate about the apparent limitations of our equipment and fundamental problems like frequency. How many squadrons should operate on the same frequency? A minimum of 3, a Gruppe, was set, but was a whole Geschwader, which is a wing, practical? Or even several Geschwader, if they were involved in a similar task? The debate ranged about, with few, if any, real changes being made from the experience that had been gained. One thing which had proved to be positive was the value of having the 2 1.5 kilowatt transmitter units available for each Gruppe. This had proved to be invaluable when breakdowns occurred. In fact, the key to the argument about how many aircraft should be on the same frequency lay in how the radio was used rather than how many people were using it. This is called radio discipline. As soon as a situation began to warm up a bit, the transmissions would increase and in moments the frequency would be swamped and all that could be heard was a high-pitched whistling as the receivers became overwhelmed. However hard we tried to maintain some order, as soon as any action began, the radio was swamped. There didn't seem to be much we could do about it. Equally, the radio frequency was common to all on it, and sometimes we heard things that might have been better to have missed. For example, on one occasion we were using the same frequency as Fighter Squadron 26 and some of our transmissions overlapped. There were probably other units which we couldn't identify, but all we would get was the initial transmission. Something like, "Attention, 3 o'clock high," would be clear, then the radio would become overwhelmed and we could only catch the occasional word. Then everybody would give up and would become quiet for a while. On this occasion, the silence was broken by an anguished cry for help.
Spitfire hinter mir, Spitfire hinter mir.
Spitfire behind me, Spitfire behind me. There was no reply, just the hiss of static on the line for a few seconds before the voice returned, shaking with fear this time.
Spitfire immer noch hinter mir, was soll ich tun? Ist immer noch hinter mir.
Still behind me, what shall I do? He's still there. Then came a single clear reply and everyone recognized Galland's voice.
Aussteigen, Sie Bettmesser.
Jump out, you bedwetter. I don't know who the man was or if indeed he came back, we were only pleased that he wasn't one of ours. Nobody seemed to have learned any lessons from the French campaign, and our communications would continue to be fatally flawed. There was no link between the bombers and the fighters, it wasn't just a question of frequency. The bombers used Morse and we used a voice-operated system RT, radio telephony. Many instances had occurred where it would have been of great advantage for a fighter leader to have been able to communicate with a bomber group leader, but it couldn't be done. Later I was to make an attempt to get at least one set installed in the aircraft of the bomber wing commander, but without success. In retrospect, I see this gap in the communications link being another of the fundamental reasons why the Battle of Britain was lost. Another area where this lack of ability to communicate was to have tragic consequences was the air-sea rescue. Again, there was no link between the fighters and the seaplanes and motorboats who could rescue our colleagues down in the water. We would see one of our fighters ditch or see our colleague parachuting down and were in a position to help the Seenotflugkommando, which is the air-sea rescue, to locate the downed flyer. But the best we could do was make direct contact with our own base station and pass on what details we could. He would then have to telephone the rescue HQ and they would then try to pass on the information via Morse code. Of course, each time the information is handled, there's a chance for a mistake or for it not to be passed on, and the more links there are in the chain, the more likely it is to break. It would have been so much easier if we could have passed on a position or any other information directly to the rescue plane. I have no doubt that many lives would have been saved if we could have done this. But I had learned to keep quiet about such things and got on with more immediate tasks. Our filming adventures were beginning to yield good results as we became more practiced. When Mr. Binder, the photographic dealer in Stuttgart, had developed our films and saw the results, he became most enthusiastic and offered us as much film as he could. It is such a pity that so much of it was lost later in the war. It was great stuff. Hardly anyone was using 8mm film at that time, and had it not been lost, it would have made a fantastic record. Our flights for filming were called combat training, and that wasn't wholly untrue, but for the most part we were about getting plenty of air-to-air shots. We would choose the brightest and sunniest days for the best light and color, and then Kühler would take off as my wingman and we climbed up to about 4,000 meters. Once trimmed out at altitude, I would hold the stick between my knees and film Kühler as he drew up to me in tight formation. But the 109 couldn't be held easily in balanced flight without actively flying it, and so my aircraft would always gradually go into a roll and then into a slow increasing dive. Kühler would follow this through, and we would get a beautifully evolving series of shots as we would first see the sun on the upper surfaces of the aircraft and then the pale blue belly. In the background, you'd have the vivid blue sky as it can only be seen at altitude contrasting against the clouds, and then far below the patchwork kilt of the fields and woods of Germany. You have to bear in mind that it had only been us lucky few that had ever seen anything like this, and to be able to bring something of the beauty of flight down to earth was something special. People are all too familiar today with aerial photography and can even see films of the Earth shot from the moon, but in those days there were few who had seen the glory of flight. At Zerbst, Hinak and myself were very disgruntled at the prospect of another Sitzkrieg in the Ruhr. As a bit of an outlet, we hoisted a white bedsheet on the flagpole in front of the barracks as a mark of our surrender. It was well received by the lower ranks, but the senior officers didn't seem to appreciate the joke. The flag got tangled around the post and we had to get it down, Hinak standing on my shoulders. For this very special occasion, we had a photograph taken. The surrender of the first group of Fighter Squadron 52 at Zerbst. I had hardly finished one of my letters home expressing my bitter disappointment at our surrender at Zerbst when new orders reached us. We were to return to the Channel and, even better, right into the thick of it. A new airfield at Coquelles, the closest to the British coast. Now we should see what we longed for. Some action. On July the 30th, 1st and 2nd Squadrons flew out to Bönninghardt, northwest of Krefeld, in preparation, and a selected group of technicians and some of my Nachrichtenzug personnel were crammed into our Tante U and flown down to Coquelles. It was abundantly clear that this was to be a fast move. All indications were that things were hotting up at the Channel. This time there was no completely organized move of the personnel and their equipment by train, they were just ordered to the new location using their own transport. This all added an exciting air to the proceedings and galvanized everybody into frantic action. The vital ground-to-air communications equipment couldn't be sent by air, so I asked the advance squad if they would give me a call as soon as they were on site and could guide me in with my yellow 16. First I went with the vehicles by road, but from past experience we had learned that we shouldn't send all the vehicles in one convoy, but rather let them all find their own way in small groups or individually via Holland and Belgium into northern France. Both the Poles and the Allies had paid dearly for having too many multi-vehicle convoys. They were extremely vulnerable to air attack, and a couple of determined fighter pilots could easily put 20 or 30 vehicles out of commission in seconds. Better to disperse and regroup at the destination. On August the 1st, I was just starting to feel a little envious of my fellow pilots who had left for Bönninghardt when I got a call from the duty officer to say that he'd had a call from Coquelle to say that they were ready. I tried to call back, but that was asking a lot. I had the French telephone network to contend with, which was never too reliable, and to complicate things, it was difficult to get connected to the new location. In the end, I decided to go without any further contact. I was pleased that I could act independently and planned my route to Coquelle. I would have to make a stop on the way, but I avoided Bönninghardt in case the squadron leaders there found a job for me. I wanted to get to the channel and nothing was going to stand in my way. I therefore planned my stopover at Wesel, an airfield very close to the Rhine and easy to locate. Before lunch, I set out after asking our Flugleitung, which is the air traffic service at Zerbst, to inform Wesel of my intended arrival in transit to Coquelle. That would ensure that fuel was available for me, and with a bit of luck, I'd be able to call to Coquelle. I avoided any further contact with Bönninghardt. Nothing was going to stop me from moving the first group of Fighter Squadron 52 to Coquelle. The flight plan worked out well, the weather was good, and I only had to make one circuit of the area to find Wesel. On landing, my aircraft was refueled like a race car, and I was taken direct to the Kommandantur, which is the control center, to place my call to Coquelle. I was really pleasantly surprised how well organized the whole thing was. Within moments of my arriving, I was talking to one of my men in France who described the new location. I was to fly to Calais and then follow the coast road until I saw some small woods with some buildings at the south end. This was a monastery, and south of that was the landing field. Although it was nothing more than a stubble field, the Ju-52 had landed there, so why not me? I only hoped that my men had walked the landing strip with a pilot's eye. One deep furrow might not have wrecked our plump old Tante U, but it could see me upside down in a burning fighter. The only map I could get at the time was a 1 to 1 million scale, and this was really too small a scale for accurate cross-country navigation. More usual is the 1 to 500,000, twice the scale and more detailed. Still, I had to make the best of what I had. I wasn't going to hang around waiting for another map. I told them I would depart Wesel at 1400 hours and that they should start looking out for me at about 1500 hours. I didn't even stop to eat. Again, the flight was textbook. First flying through smoky clouds over the industrial regions of Holland and Belgium, but with the sky clearing, the closer I got to the coast. The huge column of smoke which had so characterized our early flights at Dunkirk and Calais was now gone. Below me now, I could see the rows and rows of abandoned vehicles and stores on the beaches. I wondered how any army could lose so much and still be an army. Was there really anyone left in Britain to fight? The beaches, which had not been the focus of the action, were clean and clear, looking radiant in the summer sun and giving a feeling more like taking a holiday than moving into a war zone. Beautiful as it was, I couldn't spend too much time savoring the beauty of the French coast. I had to navigate and, more importantly, keep a weather eye open for British fighters. The closer I got to the coast, the more likely it became that I might run into some intruders. Although there had been little incursion into our airspace since Dunkirk, I was keenly aware that Spitfires could cross the channel in about 10 minutes at full throttle, and I was a lone, novice pilot who would be a tempting target. Thus, I kept my head down at 500 meters and kept my eyes open. I hadn't been too worried exactly where I met the coast, but I soon identified La Panne, and of course, the vast dump that Dunkirk had become was unmistakable. Following the coast virtually due west, I soon passed Gravelines and Calais and knew that I was close to Coquelle. To my right was the channel, glinting and sparkling as the summer sun was reflected from the rippling waters, and clearly, there too were the white cliffs of Dover, so close, so very, very close. Following my instructions, I flew down the coast road and soon spotted the woods and the monastery buildings. Closing the throttle a little to lose speed, I pulled the yellow 16 into a circular orbit over what should be the field. Below, I could now pick out some of our vehicles, most of them already camouflaged and invisible to the casual observer. Then I spotted some of the men in the field and the eruption of smoke from a smoke candle. That both marked the direction and strength of the wind and also the beginning of a landing strip. Nervously, I flew around getting lower, checking for power cables and anything that would indicate a hazard in the field. It all looked clear, but by the time I'd finished my own visual check, a second candle was needed. I'd spotted some power lines on the approach route and judged what altitude I'd need to clear them without approaching too high. Satisfied that things were about as good as they were going to get, I throttled back the DB601 and felt for the pitch control with my thumb. I brought the propeller to fine pitch, watching the hands of the indicator clock come to 12 o'clock and letting the airspeed drop back. Then I selected the flaps and lowered the undercarriage, feeling the reassuring thumbs through the airframe as the legs locked down and the 2 green lights winked at me. Skimming in over the perimeter, I rounded the descent out and let the 109 sink onto the field. There was a rumble and she pitched about a bit as we made contact with the rough surface, throwing up a huge cloud of dust and chaff, especially when I reopened the throttle to maneuver. By kicking the rudder left and right and towing the brakes, I could see one of the ground crew directing me towards the trees and cover. The long nose of the 109 made it impossible to see directly forwards when taxiing, and I had to steer a rather erratic course to maintain a clear view. Only minutes after landing my aircraft, it was under cover and virtually invisible from the sky. Everyone was aware how close we had now moved to the front line. From the outset, I decided that I was going to sleep in a tent, staying close to the center of things. Our newly arrived personnel had been quick to avail themselves of some of the massive stocks of equipment which had been left by the British, and we now had first-class bell tents much better than our own. These were pitched over a circular hole in the ground, more than a meter deep, and really made for quite a comfortable billet. There were no firm orders or instructions regarding the booty, which was everywhere, and in the absence of clear guidance on this kind of requisitioning, the new units quickly stocked up. Things are really heating up now as Uli gets deployed to the front lines, and this time for real. We will see if he gets lucky in the next episode. As for this episode, I find it interesting how things that are commonplace today, even integral to effective radio communications, were apparently unknown back then. Radio discipline, for example, was one of the very first things burned into my mind when I joined the army. Just imagining everyone babbling over each other on the wire gives me anxiety and a headache. Oh, how much things have improved since back then. Anyway, thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Cheers and bye-bye.